My name's Ed Piskor,
I'm Jim Rugg.
the man of the hour today, Jimmy. From across the pond, the great Pat Mills, creator of 2000 AD, writer of martial law, one of my favorite Judge Dredd stories, the Cursed Earth saga. What else, man? There's so much stuff.
Charlie's War, ABC Warriors, Nemesis the Warlock, martial law, Metalzoic, Toxic, Crisis. I'm amazed at the resume that he has put together in his career.
Let's talk Space Warp up at the top of the show. But before we do that, how do you pronounce the name of the barbarian with that's spelled Slaine?
Okay, well, this is where I come unstuck, because of course it should be pronounced Slaughter or some variation thereof, depending on which part of Ireland you come from.
You're the creator, so you tell us how his name is pronounced. This is for the audience people who always correct us.
Well, it's my bad, because when I was creating the character, I never thought anyone was ever going to ask me this, So I thought, the accent over the A looks cool. Now, if I hadn't put that damned accent over the A, I could have just said Slaine. And, it'd been a long day or something. So I thought, hey, the accent, because it's meant to have an accent over the A. And I suppose I was looking for a really aggressive, typically barbarian title. And Slaine, well, you can't get me meaner than that, really. And so that's the background on it. And it's a character that I suppose I've sort of been next to Charlie's War, probably the most loved personally for me of all my characters. I guess because it reflects my sort of Irish heritage.
Let's talk about the modern day, though. Space Warp, as of this recording, the first issue is out, and digitally speaking, for a while there, it was the number one release, though it was usurped by My Little Pony, and we just simply cannot stand for that. So that's why we're here. That's why we're talking, because we have a thing called the Kayfabe effect, and we send our audience places, and I want all of them to check out the first issue and subscribe to Space Warp. But please tell us what that is.
Okay. Well, any of you guys who are familiar with 2000 AD, you're probably going to say, I really love the early 2000 ADs. And, like, for example, you mentioned Cursed Earth. And then something kind of went wrong in the 1990s. There's different opinions on it, but you could basically say the readership grew up with the comic, and it grew up too far, too fast, too far. And so it kind of lost touch with its original audience. So various people tried to make 2000 AD something that it was not. And you've mentioned that you've seen me on the 2000 AD documentary, which is saying, leave it alone, just back off. And so Space Warp is really taking us back to our roots. It's the 2000 AD that so many readers grew up with, and I want a new generation to grow up with. And my God, I'm not saying that's going to be easy, because, a lot's changed. But at the end of the day, the audience, if you like, a 13, 14, 15-year-old who like the original 2000 AD, there will be his counterpart. Don't say his grandchildren or something like that. That's going to weird me out. But yeah, the rules of drama don't change over one or two generations. We all love Dickens, and that was 150 years ago or something. So, the rules of drama don't change. Presentation changes, but you have to stay in touch with your audience. And Space Warp is about staying in touch with those readers. And the way it's done sounds deceptively simple, and you would be amazed at how few people follow this really simple rule. In fact, quite a lot of them may well bristle when they hear what I'm about to say. You put the reader first and yourself second. Now, that doesn't mean to say you're an automaton and just giving the reader what does he want. It could be argued that a lot of readers just want guys posing and strutting around with big guns. So yeah, you've got to give them a bit more than that. They actually want more. So what you've got to do is you give the reader what they want, but then you pump into that story what you want to say. And so that your stories all have a particular philosophy. And the philosophy that Spacewalk has is one that in one form or another, a lot of your readers in the States are going to be already familiar with, which is that very British attitude towards authority, establishment, and so on. So, you know, whether they've seen it in a Marvel or a DC story, there is that thing of, oh yeah, that's a very Brit way of looking at things. And yeah, I mean, I actually think that's not entirely fair to an American audience because, you know, in the States, you have some incredibly subversive material, far more subversive than any of us in Britain. I'm thinking of the Larry David show, and I think, my God, how can he get away with that? But somehow that doesn't happen in comics. Your comics, forgive me, but for the most part, I think they're quite corporate. You know, they're fighting. What are they fighting? Middle Eastern terrorists, psychopaths, and the artists and writers who do it, they do it really well. But there's a very narrow band of bad guys. Whereas in Britain, we know who the real bad guys are. And if you look at Spacewalk, you can recognize them. I mean, well, let's think. In Hellbreaker, for example, there's a cosmic assassin, and he's escaped from hell to take vengeance on the living, and his first target is a British Prime Minister, who of course doesn't in any remote way resemble any British Prime Minister in recent times, or at least that's what I shall say.
Yeah, you have a history of doing this kind of thing right here, Patrick. I seem to remember what was it, issue 2 of 2000 AD when there was some lady got shot on the steps of Parliament. She looked familiar to some readers.
Oh yeah, it was issue 1. It was indeed. It was. She was known in the comic strip as Lady Shirley Brown, but of course, no. What happened was the publisher, and we might come on to him later, because this I think shows what you might call the creative side of the publisher, John Sanders. He said to me, this is on 2000 AD, let's do a Russian invasion of Britain. And I said, because it's very, very right-wing, very Tory, and I said to him, but John, why would they want to invade Britain? And he said, they want our oil. They're after our oil. And I went, oh, well, I don't know if I can get excited about that. And he said, read the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. You'll feel differently about it then. And I was still lukewarm. And he said, look, we'll have the top newscaster announcing the news. It was a lady called Angela Rippon, who Brit readers will know who that is. And, it's BBC, like Fox News announcing this terrible event. And I went, yeah, really? And he said, and we'll have the British Prime Minister, who will be Margaret Thatcher, and she'll be shot on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I said, John, I think you persuaded me. So I was seduced by that possibility. And so they all had wonderful Russian uniforms and everything. And then at the very last minute, John said, I can't get it through the board, guys. You're going to have to make them not Russian, alter the uniform a bit and make them from some fictional state. So they became Volgans, and it was a great shame. But everyone still knew that Lady Shirley Brown was Margaret Thatcher, and there we are.
Pat, what was your socially? Where were you at around those times? Whenever you created 2000 AD, because not too far before that or around that same time, there's the Queen's Silver Jubilee, and the Sex Pistols are playing God Save the Queen on a boat, kind of following her parade around. And 2000 AD happens around there. What was your place? You were about 28 or so when punk rock happens. Were you a teddy boy?
I think you've got my age right there. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not having to do this. I think, as you'll doubtless know, because you guys look in your 20s yourselves, right?
You're very kind.
You'll doubtless know what it's like. Buttering you up there. You know what it's like if you're 20, or if you're 24, or if you're 28. It's an eternity between it. So at 28, I think I would probably have regarded myself as far too old for punk, and but I think the whole thing about punk is that it's an attitude, it's a way of life. And in one of the stories in Spacewalk, I actually addressed this very specifically. It's a story called Jurassic Punks. It's set in Liverpool, and it's set in this era. So there's lots of references to the emergence of punk and so forth. Because I wanted to see exactly when it kicked off. And you're right, it would have kicked off roughly around the launch time of 2000 AD. But I think it was only Mike McMahon, who I think he went to Chelsea Art College, where I think the Sex Pistols did one of their very earliest gigs. And I suspect Mike would have been lucky enough to have actually been there at that kickoff. But that attitude had been around since forever. So if you were to go back to, say, 1972, I think, something like that, there was the kids' comic version of Oz, which was notorious, and it actually ended up with the editor in the dock at the Old Bailey, being tried for, I don't know, whatever it was, filth probably, something like that. But the punk attitude actually goes all the way back at least to the 1920s, which is why the heroine in Jurassic Punks is actually called Dada, from the Dada movement. And if you look at the Dada paintings, and even the early Picasso stuff from around that time, it's very subversive. It's really saying that, So I wanted to show that it was a universal thing. So even though probably at 28, I was probably fairly straight looking and all the rest of it, I definitely identified, yeah.
Pat, one of the things that I'm curious about with Space Warp starting up, there was something in the 2000 AD documentary where many of the artists and creators expressed joy and enthusiasm in the early days of 2000 AD, and it struck me how important that is, to the life of a new book or any piece of art or story. How important do you think that is for starting up a new comic, and how do you sort of, bring that level of enthusiasm out of the creators that you're working with?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential. And in recent years, I have to say, that hasn't been necessarily the case with 2000 AD. So it has a dampening effect. You've got to keep that energy going, that buzz around things. And, well, there's several ways of doing it. You've got to be paying the creators a reasonable amount of money. Now, I think when 2000 AD kicked off, I think a lot of the artists were so thrilled to be in print that, nothing else matters. You know what I mean? When you get your first break on things, you don't look too closely at the small print. And then as you get your first mortgage or whatever it is, you go, wait a minute, what's this? And so there was that natural enthusiasm. And so that's one way. In other words, you're giving new creators a break. And that certainly happened in the case of Spacewalk, where I didn't preset how it was going to be, but the 6 creators involved are new names, just as they were with 2000 AD. So, I hope there'll be the Mike McMahons, the Brian Bollins of tomorrow. And if I look at the quality of their work, there's every reason why that should be. So you've got that initial buzz. Secondly, there's also a bit of friendly competition between them. So when one artist sees another guy's stuff, he goes, wow, I've got to do better, or I'm going to throw that piece out. And so there's like, it's a friendly competition. It's not an aggressive competition.
Pat, do you poke the bear a bit, and do you send JPEGs from one artist to another and just say, "Hey, look at what this fella did yesterday"?
I try and do it in a very subtle way. So, but you're ahead of me there. Yes, of course it happens. But I don't, if one artist just turned in this masterpiece, I don't go, "Hey guys, look what this guy has done." So yeah, so you've got that kind of friendly competition, and what you've also got to do is to make the artists feel it's all worthwhile. Now, in the case of Spacewalk, and I think in the case of 2000 AD, it means you play to the artist's strengths. So if the artist likes drawing one particular thing or a particular style, you don't give him something alternative to draw. You know what I mean? So so in the case of Hellbreaker, I wrote the script to have a very, a lot of romantic tension, if you like. I wouldn't say it was Twilight in style, but it's certainly aimed at that age group. In other words, there's a kind of sexual tension between the villain, who's incredibly handsome, and this beautiful cop who's got to, send him back to hell. She's from the DIA, the Department of Infernal Affairs, and she's got to send this demon back to hell. But you can tell from just looking at the two of them that there is, her body language is telling you something. You think, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? So you need an artist who can do that. But if you said to an artist who, let's say, loves drawing big guns and big tanks and isn't that interested in drawing beautiful women, I mean, it would kill him, this story. You just go, no. Let's find you a different story. Let's find something a bit more, I don't know, macho, whatever. So you but you also evolve the story to suit the particular artist. So again, I'm thinking of Jurassic Punks. The story evolved when I saw the heroine, Dada Durda. She's this beautiful blonde punk, and it evolved. So it evolved because the artist drew her so well. Now, if he'd drawn her looking a bit, I don't know, a bit so-so, I'd have just played her role down. But suddenly, she becomes as much the hero or heroine as the male protagonist. So the story was originally called Jurassic Man, and then you think, no, wait a minute, it's got to be called Jurassic Punks. And if it goes on this way, the male hero is going to get a supporting role, and she's going to end up as the main character. So you're rolling with the way that the artist does things, and that's how we got a lot of the enthusiasm in the early days of 2000 AD. And another thing that we can't do today, even if COVID wasn't around, but maybe if COVID wasn't around, I think we would do it. Yes, we would. Although not as well as we once did on 2000 AD, which was the artists would come into the office. So they'd all meet up, and then they'd all go and get drunk together and all get a bit competitive with each other and so on. I can remember one 2000 AD artist saying to another one, in the league of the top 10 league of artists, where would you rate me? Now, he said this to another, I can tell you the second artist's name, because he won't mind, I don't think, because it's a compliment to him. Where would you place me in the top 10? And the second artist, who's Mike McMahon, of course, and I can't quite get his voice, said, 10. Do you know what I mean? 10. With that, very punk kind of response. So, but I mean, that's a great vibe if artists can meet up. And I think we can do a certain amount virtually. And please, when this COVID thing is over, I want to be able to create some scenarios where the artists meet up because I owe them a great deal as well. I mean, you know, they've taken on this project essentially based on my reputation. So it's got to sell, you know. I mean, I owe them that. You know, that's our model, that they get paid on sales results. Now, there's no reason why that shouldn't work. But, you know, until it's in their bank account, you know, I can't rest on my laurels. So I think one of the things we would probably try and do, well, one of the things we definitely would do once COVID has died down, perhaps, is, you know, hire an upstairs bar in a London pub and get to meet so the artists meet each other, but also the audience. And one of the things I want to try to do, and you guys will probably be aware of this, and I won't say I can change it immediately, but I want to change the vibe of it. I'm dismayed at when, and it's probably the same in the States, at the 2000 AD 40th, and it's no different for me either. It's all about how many books you can sign and sell. Do you know what I mean? So you've got artists sketching away, but it didn't used to be like that. What used to happen was artists and writers would hang out at the bar, talk to fans. It was a much more relaxed attitude. And they'd probably, as the day and the evening progressed, they'd probably all get kind of smashed and probably end up fighting each other and all the rest of it. But it was a relaxed vibe. It wasn't about how many books you can sign or how many sketches you can sell, this kind of thing. And I think the reason it was like that, certainly right through the 80s, was because there was enough, you were being paid enough to make it worthwhile. And even though the rights situation was rubbish, you were still making enough money to say, well, okay, that isn't very good, but, you know, we're still doing quite well. We're doing, you know, it's better than being a window cleaner kind of thing, you know? I don't think any of us were or are, you know, business tycoons, you know. none of us are aiming to be billionaires or anything like that. It is a love of the whole creative process. So I think that kept us together, that kind of thing. And as I say, I want to try and recreate that, and possibly in a virtual way as well. I know that there are, you know, people are talking about virtual comic conventions and things. And I think maybe we have to do a few of these things if everyone's not really allowed to congregate for another year or so. So that's all to play for.
It feels like we are living in a 2000 AD Prague right now, when COVID's been around long enough where the commercials on television are people with masks on their faces and stuff.
I just heard somebody say that in regards to like the beginning of a baseball game, and how it feels like we're in this movie where the announcers right at the top before the game begins is like, 7 of the Cardinals players have come down with the virus. And it'd be like the intro to Mad Max, or, you know, like the opening sequence or something. Yeah, for sure. Weird times in that regard. Pat, you've worked with so many artists early in their careers. What do you look for, you know, as editor or writer, collaborator? What catches your eye with artists? How are you finding these people? How did you find the team for Spacewalk?
Yeah, I think I spend a lot of time looking at artists. I look for that, what I call the divine spark. You know what I mean? That extra something they've got. And I like introducing them to the industry. I get a kick out of it. You know what I mean? In other words, and I think that's why I've introduced so many new artists. And in recent years, for example, I've been somewhat stymied, and that really pissed me off. Case in point, fantastic artist called Faye Dalton. And if you look her up, you'll see what I mean. I mean, her artwork is sensational. And the minute I saw her stuff, I thought, my God, this is the next, I shouldn't really use this term, but it's a quick shortcut. You know, it's the next, no, not the next Simon Bisley, because she's not like that, doesn't have that kind of personality or anything, but, you know, the next status, if you like, or like Brian Bolland or Frank Miller or anyone like that. In other words, it's a fantastic artist. And I couldn't get her into 2000 AD. I couldn't believe it. And I couldn't get a straight answer as to why. And I think, and you always know when you see a really talented artist, you know, the clock's ticking. You know, sooner or later, someone's going to swoop and nick them. You know what I mean? And it was often the case. I'd find this artist and I'd sometimes, if I could, let the artwork build up a bit before it actually appeared in the comic, because I knew that the minute it appeared, Karen Berger of Vertigo or whatever be swooping down on this artist and saying, "Hey, you want to work for DC Comics, etc., etc. We can pay you whatever it is, twice as much, and give you royalties and blah blah blah." So I've always had that kind of vibe about it. What do I look for? Well, in the case of Spacewalk, I wrote a kind of introductory spiel telling the artist what I was looking for and what I didn't want. And one of the things I would have stressed, for example, would have been, I don't want a cartoony style, because the readers of this genre don't want cartoons, which is a pity, because I love cartoons, and we did some cartoons in Toxic, and Kevin O'Neill and I thought the cartooniest story would be incredibly popular. It was called The Driver, and we loved it. It was a foul-mouthed driver driving this polluted lorry across America and dumping it on an Indian reservation. And it was wonderful black humor, and we thought it was hilarious, and the readers went, and we were gutted. So, you know, you learn from your mistakes, and so no cartoons was definitely a no-no. And I would explain that, for instance, in the case of Hellbreaker, I wanted that sensuality about the artwork. So this attracted an artist, Ian Ashcroft, who really has a really great vibe in that direction. And similarly, with our war story, which is called SF1, which stands for Special Forces 1, you know, I probably said in my opening spiel something to the effect that, you know, it's got to press the same buttons as Rogue Trooper, as Bad Company, you know, kind of classic Starship Troopers. It's got to press that kind of button. And, you know, I was thinking to myself, my God, it's a kind of group story. So you've got 6 weird-looking heroes, 2 robots, 2 humans, and 2 aliens. And you're thinking, God, am I really going to get this? And yeah, artists came out of the woodwork, and you know, if you look at it, you can see this has got that Starship Troopers vibe, which future war is very popular. It's when we were debating what we were going to have on the cover of Spacewalk for a while, we really thought, should we have a future war cover? Because we know that you're immediately going to pull in some of those Halo readers, right? You know that you're going to get some of them. But you're at the same time, you're going to not alienate, but you're not going to attract, what should we say, more of a unisex audience. And the audience that we were particularly after in the long run, and we've got to get them first, and there are indications we will, is the Fortnite audience. So we looked at a lot of Fortnite covers and saw the vibe that they have, which is different. And incidentally, one of the reasons why the cover has a particular vibe is because we sell it on Amazon. And if you have the characters firing a machine gun directly at the audience, it breaks some kind of Amazon taboo. They think everyone's going to be corrupted by it. So we keep that for inside.
There's like this long tradition in British comics of the weekly format, and you guys are you guys abiding by that with Space Warp?
In a certain sense, yes. I think there's a style with British comics which arguably is weekly, but at its core is the anthology. Now, it is unique to Brits. It's the one thing we do, and we do it really well, which is why, you know, don't anybody else try to do it, because it is a British disease. We do it really well because it's in our blood, right? So the British story is told in a really intense way. Traditionally, when I first came into British comics, I think they were having as many as, like, I don't know, say 9 pictures on a page, you know, of action and so on. And, you know, story would be only, say, 3 pages long. So you're getting this kind of mini novel that you're reading in 3 pages. And 2000 AD, I said, okay, let's spread this out a bit. It's too constipated. It's too condensed. So let's spread it out. Let's really let the artwork breathe. But we like that kind of intense storytelling. And if you look at Spacewalk, you'll see that if that was told, I think in say an American comic, an 8-page story in Spacewalk would probably be 22 pages in an American comic, because the pacing would be, what shall we say, more choreographed and and there would be a plus side to that. It would argue to be a little more cinematic or whatever, but it can also be a little more empty. And one of the things that about this intense story style is that it's really got to hook the reader. Now, with a weekly comic in particular, and this also applies to Spacewalk, they're not going to wait 5 weeks for the story to really pick up, right? And I think sometimes, maybe, I don't know, I could be wrong on this, but I think that some American comics, you've got to wait a while for the whole mystery. If you're trying to appeal to a 13-year-old kid, you can't say to him, no, he's not going to wait. He is not going to wait for that. A better example is on, I think it's on Netflix, Warrior Nun, where I'm told that in episode 6, the heroine finally becomes proactive and finally turns into the warrior nun. But you've got to sit through 6 episodes. Now, because I'm an ex-Catholic, I thought, no, I'm going to stay the course on this. And so I watched all these other amazing, beautiful nuns running around doing their kind of martial arts stuff and so on. But I was thinking, when is the heroine going to be proactive? And I gave up on episode 5. I thought, you know what, life's too short. I'm going to give up on this. So it's a rule of comics, and it's a rule that I think is followed in the States, but it's very intense in British comics. The hero must be proactive, and he's got to do something every episode, which in a typical anthology is every week. So in Spacewalk, which isn't weekly, and I'll get back to that, every hero has to do something very proactive. So you think, wow, here's the business. And it's that proactive scene that I would ask for as a sample scene from every artist, which is a real ball breaker. You're saying to them, come in on the 3rd act and draw this amazing scene of the hero having bullets flying through him, and he's still running heroically, and he's jumping through the air. He grabs hold of this 4x4 door, rips it off, and then has a massive punch up with the alien driver. And you say, yeah, do that as a sample page, and yeah, we'll see if that works out. So anyone who can get past that, and all those 6 artists did, but it's delivering, because that's what a 14-year-old wants. I think as 2000 AD's readers got older, they got more, what should we say, they got more laid back, they anticipated more subtle aspects of things, and they were also more polite. So when you meet 2000 AD readers today, and they're in their 40s, they're wonderful to talk to. If you met the original 2000 AD readers, when they were about 14, they could be extremely rude, really rude. They'd pass your desk and go, yeah, no, I don't like your stuff. And move on to the next one. So, but I like the challenge of that audience. If you can hook, and particularly with today's TikTok generation, whose attention span is arguably even more limited than it was back then. That's a real challenge, because the great thing about them is they don't know who you are. You know what I mean? They're 13 off, and we've done this already. We've put Spacewalk out to a school. It was a punk school, admittedly, so we knew, you know, it wasn't a school frequented by the nobility, shall we say. And we've canvassed a lot of kids and said, what do you think of the stories? And because we know that, you know, we need that feedback to know we've got it right. And the feedback we got was pretty much correct. But the great thing was in giving it to 13, 14 and 15-year-olds, male and female, to read, they don't know who I am. Whereas if you give it to a 45-year-old guy, oh yeah, I grew up reading Slonia, right? Or whatever it is. And they go, oh yeah, well, this is probably okay. You know what I mean? Yeah, this is good. Yeah. But the 13-year-old's looking at it and thinking, who's this bloke? I don't care. Okay, what's it? Oh yeah, that's not bad. That's much more challenging. And making stories work for that audience. There was a time, and this is where I am showing my age, where we all knew how to do that. In other words, the particular skills I'm bringing to Spacewalk, they're not unique to me. There's probably other people who've moved on to other things in life who arguably could have done it even better. But it's embarrassing to say I'm the last man standing who has those skills for that audience. Not necessarily for a let's say for 30 or 40-year-olds. I'm sure, I don't know, Grant Morrison or someone like that has probably got that audience in the palm of his hands. But for me, for that mainstream audience, there are particular skills that you need to draw them in, and they are very much in evidence on Spacewalk. Some of them seem a little obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many British stories, at least, make this error. I'll just give you one example. We learnt the hard way that you have to have the hero's name, directly or indirectly. The title of the story must have the hero's name in it. Jurassic Punks, that's still the hero's name. They are Jurassic Punks. Hellbreaker, he might be called De La Rue, but he's a Hellbreaker. And so you have to have the hero's name in the title. If you have a story called Inferno, for example, or Hellblast or something, it doesn't have the hero's name in the title. It will never be as successful. Now, I think everyone on your side of the pond knows this because you have Batman, Spider-Man, and so on. But you'd be surprised in Britain how many people still break that rule. And the only reason I bang on about it is because I want to see comics succeed above and beyond what I do. And I learned this rule and 100 other rules the hard way, not because I'm especially bright or anything, because every time you get kicked in the nuts, you think, okay, next time I'm going to do this differently. Because you think, I thought this story was going to be so popular. And the readers go, So you really think about it, you think, I know why. It's because the hero's name's not in the title. And after a while, you get it. And so you think, for God's sake, I've got to pass this information on. You know what I mean? Because, as I say, in the States, you do it automatically. You'd be amazed at how many British stories, including one or two of mine in the past, that break this rule. You have to have the hero's name. To come back to your point about, will it be a weekly? If only. The first thing is, this first phase, we come out digitally. We're out digitally as we speak with a guided view, which I think makes a huge difference. And I think a lot of people don't even know what a guided view is. But the good news is, if you're looking at, I know this is probably obvious to you guys, but you'd be surprised how many people it isn't obvious to. if you're looking at a comic on your mobile phone, which arguably a lot of 14-year-olds might be, with a guided view, the images are whatever size you want them to be. So it's, and it has almost a kind of hypnotic animation feeling. I kind of enjoy it myself because I'm quite a lazy reader. I don't want to do this thing that a lot of 40-year-olds and older will do, where they'll look at a page and they'll go, I wonder what's happening there. Younger readers don't like that. You know what I mean? Like, we had a 16-year-old girl said how much she liked Hellbreaker and how much she liked Dada Durda, the heroine of Jurassic Punks, but she didn't like one of the other stories, and I genuinely can't remember which one it was, because she said it was a little hard to follow and it reminded her of her dad's comics. And you think, ouch. And probably the three of us are all fans of her dad's comics. You know what I mean? We're probably thinking, what was she talking about? Martial Law or Frank Miller or Grant Morrison or whatever, you know? And it's that recognizing, because some of them, they've been out of comics, at least they are in Britain. And that's where Manga stepped in, because one of the things with Manga, whatever else, it's really easy to follow. There's no mental effort required whatsoever. You just flick over the images and, you know, it's so easy. I could fall asleep reading it. Do you know what I mean? So, so there's all those criteria. And to come back to where we're at, we start off, as I say, with this virtual, with digital version. And then in October, we come out with the paper version. And then we've got Christmas sales. And then after Christmas, with the knowledge I'm currently acquiring on TikTok and YouTube and all those other ways of trying to reach that those youth influencers who really, they basically decide, you know, what a 14 or 15-year-old is going to read. So, or a lot of them do anyway. So I think we need to go through that whole phase of sales and then see, well, okay, how well is it sold? It's already selling well. What we need to see first of all is it going to take 6 months to pay the artist the minimum fee that we want to give them? Or is it going to take a year, or is it going to take 18 months? It's definitely selling. We won't know until after Christmas exactly what. Now, if the sales are really high, then I could never do this weekly. I mean, my God, it would. Apart from anything else, I am the most critical bugger going. In other words, I send artwork back again and again and again. And I do this to my scripts as well. So in other words, every story that you see in Spacewalk has been rewritten 3 times. Now that's normal for a novel. In a novel, people would say, so what? Yeah, you should go through 3 drafts. It's normal. But in comics, certainly in Britain, because the money was so rubbish and because the rights deal was so rubbish, first draft's all you get. Do you know what I mean? In other words, it's straight out of the typewriter or the computer and off it goes and that's it, finish. But that's not the way to do it, because you need to take a break from it, revise it, and you should also apply a checklist and say, does it obey the rules of drama? Does the drama build to a finale? Now, a lot of comics, they wouldn't even know what you're talking about. You know, they don't follow those rules. Or I'll go back to something that's fairly neutral, say something on Vertigo. And there's a rule in drama that a scene opens one way, so it has a plus or negative value. And when you come to the end of the scene, it has to have the opposite value. And that's a rule courtesy of the great Robert McKee, the author of Story, who's my particular Bible. But I've seen stories in Vertigo where it starts one way and you're thinking, okay, and then it ends. And you're thinking, well, what's happened? And if the answer is the values haven't changed, as Robert McKee would say, then it's just exposition. It's just exposition and nothing else. So there's all these checklists to go through, which means from a writing point of view, I have to do all this. And then there's the artistic equivalent. So to cut a long story short, doing this on a weekly basis would be very difficult. So we got over it. We think we've gotten over it with two ways. One is by having a lot of good feature material in the comic, which nearly killed us to write. It takes 3 times as long to write a single one-page feature introducing the story than the actual story itself. And I think most of those features very much reflect our kind of what you might call British sense of humor. You know what I mean? They're a bit different, you know. So we're say in Jurassic Punks, we have we take the piss out of a famous leaflet from the 1970s called Protect and Survive, about surviving a nuclear blast, which basically you get in the cupboard under the stairs and you know, put a mattress up against the door and all this kind of stuff. And then we combine that with the advice on COVID, which also has its ludicrous side. And we didn't get into it quite as deeply as I'd have liked, because COVID, the whole COVID drama was unfolding literally as we were almost going to press. But you know, there's that whole thing with virtue signalers, you know, where you have to wear your mask, and if you're walking down the street and you're not wearing a mask and someone else is, they're looking across at you with that kind of, you know, what's wrong with you, you weirdo? You know, you're spreading your germs and all this kind of stuff. So in our story, it's a post-apocalypse Liverpool, and there's dinosaurs running around. They've come through a time warp, and so the whole thing with any predator is that you've got to be quiet. So the government information advice is be silent at all times. You know, put mattresses around your safe room and speak in hushed whispers and all this kind of stuff. And if you have to go outside, wear a gag so that you know, if you see a dinosaur, you don't scream your head off, because this will only encourage them. You know, so the advice is something like stay silent, stay alive, something like that. So we had a lot of fun doing that, but my God, is it labor intensive? Somehow it has to be sharper than the actual comic strip. So we have a lot of that material. So that compensates for the fact that we're not weekly. The stories are longer than weekly stories. So on average in 2000 AD, the stories were 6 pages long. On Spacewalk, for the most part, they're 8, 9, maybe 10 pages long. And then we also have this feature material to act as a backup. So as the readers, we anticipate at some point, right now they're moaning at us and saying, when's the paper edition coming out? When's the paper edition coming out? So when that's happened, and in October, we anticipate the next one will be, when's issue 2 coming out? When's issue 2 coming out? So we've tried to make a joke of that in the comic, where we've got our kind of alien associate, you know, reclining with a glass of champagne and saying, we're working really hard on it, you know, trust us, you know, we're working day and night to get this out. But by having a really interactive website, it means that we can keep things buzzing during that period where there will be a gap between issue 1 and issue 2.
What's the URL for the website? We'll put a link in there, and we'll get it at the end as well, but just in case people want to click and check it out.
Sure, spacewalkcomic.com, yeah. And there's a load of stuff on there. I think there's one free story, so if you're not too sure about it, and if you sign up to our mailing list, there's a free story by Cliff Cumber, a Brit artist who lives in the States. And so, yeah, you got that to check out to see if that's the right thing for you. Plus, there's a whole load of other stuff on the website. So we hope over a period of time that, I mean, we've only been out just over 2 weeks, I think, And so we hope over a period of time that we'll create some kind of sense of community. Because the real thing I want, and I don't know if I'm really going to solve this, because I never solved it on 2000 AD or on the various other comics. I want to try and create a team of writers and ultimately an editor to take over from me, because, you know, this was something I felt I had to do. In other words, you know, when there's something inside you that really pushes you to do it, and you think, well, no, I don't really want to do this. I just want to sit on a beach or something. And there's something, no, you've got to do Spacewalk. You've got to do Spacewalk. So my long-term objective is to find the right writers to carry on. And that is going to be so damn difficult, because the most of the writers around today have come from different traditions. So if you come from a different writing tradition to Spacewalk, it's going to end in tears. Because if you're used to, for example, I don't know, writing for Spider-Man, well, first of all, you're going to be a lot richer than I am. And secondly, you'll be used to their pacing. So you've got to suddenly change to a Brit way of pacing. That's difficult. So my guess is that what I will possibly do is what I used to do, which is I will bring people in from outside, people who said, I write, but I've never written a comic. I couldn't write a comic. And I look at what they're doing and I say, yes, you can. And I've introduced several writers like that. And that's as much of a kick as finding new artists. Because a lot of people think that there's, I don't know, that comic writing is, off limits in one way or another. And it's to take the mystique away from it. I mean, it's still hard work. I mean, if someone came along and said, hey, I want to write for Spacewalk, I still say to them, well, you know, do you have any evidence that you've, the basics of storytelling? Have you taken a course in creative writing? But if they said, I used to work for Vertigo, that wouldn't be a plus factor. Do you know what I mean? Because it would mean, okay, you think in a different way. If they said, I used to write for My Little Pony, well, given that My Little Pony defeated us at the box office, I might say, well, tell me a bit more. But it wouldn't be a no-no. A lot of the people I've introduced to comics had never drawn a comic before in their life. And there's a tradition of that in British comics that goes back to, you guys are probably familiar with the original Frank Hampson Eagle, Dan Dare. Does that mean anything to you?
Yes.
Okay, well, that sold something like 1 million copies. Now it's on its launch, but it was produced by outsiders, and people in the comic industry hated them. I mean, in Britain, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in Britain, it can get quite mean. You know, it's like, who do these guys think they are? You know, they haven't grown up through the ranks like the rest of us. Do you know what I mean? They haven't paid their dues, that kind of stuff. And so this comic Eagle came from nowhere and was a huge success. But when it started to fade and eventually died, I can assure you, in our rather mean and spiteful British comic industry, they all cheered. They were delighted. See, it finally died. It took 10 years, but they died in the end because they didn't pay their dues. I don't know if you've got the same stories in America, but it can be quite spiteful, this side of the pond.
Pat, you mentioned bringing in new writers, and you've mentioned these various rules that you use and Robert McKee's story. Robert McKee's story, I think, was maybe popularized in the mid to late 90s. So I'm kind of curious where you were coming from. Did you study writing before you got into this field? What's your...
Let me add to that as well, because I want to know about the guy who was writing the comics about a little boy and an alien goat, and how he got trusted to spearhead comics like Action and Battle and Action, and then get trusted to create 2000 AD. I want to know all of this.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot there to unpick. Well, I was trained at DC Thompson's, they're the people who still do Beano and Dandy, and they did a whole raft, and still do a whole raft of what we would call popular culture, kind of magazines for your granny, right? Wholesome magazines, and everything is. There was a real understanding of teenagers, of children, and I think that the comics were almost universally down market. So, as you doubtless know, there's a lot of snobbery, certainly here in Britain, on comics, right? In other words, people now talk about graphic novels, you know, and again, to quote, I think it's Mike McMahon who I think said, you know, that they're fat comics with bits of cardboard around them, you know, and that I think is a punk perspective on things, you know. Just calling something, well, of course, there was that wretched period, wasn't there, where I think Marvel were bringing out some of their stuff with bits of cardboard around it and calling it a graphic novel, you know, these wonderful comics, but they weren't designed to be seen necessarily in that way, shall we say. So working for this very down market publisher that was selling to a huge audiences. I mean, I worked on a teenage magazine called Romeo, which was the poor relation of Jackie. Now, Jackie in the UK was a huge success, and people still talk very fondly about it today. I think it sold something like 1 million copies a week. You know what I mean? It had comic strip in it and fashion and everything else. And John Wagner and I worked on Romeo because we weren't quite trendy enough for Jackie, but you know, but what Romeo had was it had a strong sense of story. So that's what John and I did, and John Wagner, of course, subsequently went on to create Judge Dredd, and so we learned our art on Romeo. Then we went freelance and we worked in a garden shed. And we're both big guys, and we're both in our different ways, I think, could be described as alpha males or bolshy males or something. So how the hell we survived in a garden shed, I have no idea, but somehow we did. And we were very successful at freelancing. And John went down one particular path and I went down another. And I think I was essentially... and John was to a degree as well, girls' comic writers, because with girls' comics, and I know you don't have the same division today as they used to be, but they tended to focus more on emotion. So the artwork was secondary, and as much as it had to convey feelings, but you know, there were no big tanks, there were no super guns, there were no amazing uniforms. Do you know what I mean? It was very down to earth, and we were both very successful there. And then in girls' comics, but meanwhile, the boys' comics had run into terrible trouble. They'd run into huge trouble, and it wasn't that one wasn't down to me. The one you mentioned, I'll come back to it in a sec. But there was a comic that came out called Jet, and although one or two of the stories in it weren't bad, it was ultimately a disaster. And I think it lasted 6 weeks because, you know, if something doesn't sell, you know, it's death, you know, there's no pissing about, it's gone. So this comic was called Jet, and it included a story which I think is such a clear sign of where people were going wrong, because they weren't following the Robert McKee rules or the equivalent thereof. And that was, they had a story called Paddy McGinty's Goat. Well, now, you know, okay, times have changed, but I can assure you 12-year-old boys in the 1970s would have spat on that story just as much as a 12-year-old boy today. You know, there's no real difference between the generations. Paddy McGinty's Goat I mean, how the fuck is anyone going to go, oh, I love that story, Paddy McGinty's Goat? And, you know, it's not even that it's strayed from some soppy girl story. I can assure you, 12-year-old girls would also go, screw that, you know, it's rubbish. So Paddy McGinty's Goat was about this sweet-looking boy, a little bit too sweet-looking, actually. It's slightly cringe-making. You know, he's not hard-assed at all. And he has an alien friend. Now, okay, you could say, well, that's like E.T., except that this alien, which is just a kind of vacuous alien gas, takes the form of a goat. So the boy is called Paddy McGinty, and he's still there, he's still awake, and so on and so on. So these stories were going desperately, desperately wrong. And so what they said was, the boys' comics are in trouble. Let's get in a couple of girls' comic writers to change things. And they got John Wagner and I in, and we did Battle together. And then I did Action. And then I did 2000 AD. And I should explain something that because I've been reflecting on this and thinking, well, you know, why did we succeed? And why hasn't anybody else really succeeded much outside us? And there's a really simple rule, which has nothing to do with ego or talent. It's the fact that we were freelancers. Now, you'll know yourself, as you know, any freelance work you do, you're only as good as your story, right? You're not on staff. So if everybody else who was producing things like Paddy McGinty's Goat, they're on staff. So if they, they bring out Jet and Paddy McGinty's Goat, and the readers say, this is dire, you know, never darken our newsagent's door again, they still get their salary. They've got their holiday money, their pension scheme, and all the rest of it, right? But if you're freelance, as John Wagner and I were, and are, you're only as good as your next story. You know, if I write, I don't know, maybe, say I write the next story and it isn't very good, and then say, you know, if I, you know, have a stroke or something and start writing ridiculous stuff, the readers might tolerate me for one more episode, and then they say, oh, poor Pat, yeah, he's history, it's gone. So you've got to be good. So I think the reason that 2000 AD is good, and the reason Action was good in a different kind of way, and the reason Spacewalk is good is because I'm freelance. It's got to be good. No one's paying me a salary. So if I get it wrong, no one's going to say, oh, well, you fucked up there, Pat, but here's your redundancy. Because that's what was happening with these staff guys. I kid you not, a lot of them wanted to screw up. They really wanted to screw up because then they got their redundancy. They got a big check and off they went. So there was no, the kind of enthusiasm we've been talking about, it wasn't there. They didn't care. And this was partly the fault of the publisher, John Sanders, because he had this view that we should all be flexible. We should all be able to move from comic A to comic B to comic C. Now, I'll give you an example of that. You had, what was it called? I started Action, which was a comic of the streets. It was gritty, tough, you know, as tough as your boots, that kind of thing. It was a strong pre-punk attitude, very working class. And so I started it, then I handed it over to an editor, and then he didn't care and he left. And so they said, okay, let's find another editor for it. So the editor of Action, his previous success, which he was very successful at, was a 4-year-old's comic called Bobo Bunny. So he'd gone from Bobo Bunny to this comic with lots of thugs in it. So, you know, I don't think anything that crazy could happen in American comics. I think the worst horror stories you could ever hear about Marvel or DC, right, could never compare to the kind of horror stories that come out of British comics. I mean, even when they were going on, I'd be thinking in the back of my mind, I'm going to have to make a note of this because this is so bonkers. One day, I can tell this as an anecdote at a dinner party or something because it's so crazy. And so, yeah, that was the strange world we lived in. But by being freelance, it ensures that the quality of your work is there. And it's the same for the artists on Spacewalk. They know if their story isn't as good as the other guys, maybe it won't get collected, or maybe the readers will sort of lose interest in it. And they want to, they want to be the Brian Bollens and the Dave Gibbons of tomorrow. So there's a lot of incentive there.
What's the segue to get us to talk about this memo that was sent around?
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'll just introduce it by saying that John Sanders, the publisher, brought this memo out in the late 1980s. And just to set the scene there, he was the publisher. Steve McManus was the managing editor, stroke editor of 2000 AD. And this was a time in the late 80s where something was happening to British comics, which was good, but not all good. And not everyone will agree with me on this analysis, but I really would fight my corner on this. That right through the early 1980s, we were still putting those 14, 15, and 16-year-old kids first, right? They were our main audience. But as the 1980s went on, it was starting to change, and we were starting to go for an older audience, an audience that was more representative at conventions and things. And I think it was in the course of the 1980s that Alan Moore was writing for 2000 AD, and he had written, I think, and I haven't checked my dates on this, so there'll be some comic fan who'll be saying after this, I think you'll find you got your dates wrong there, Pat. But this is my recollection anyway, and it's near enough, that he brought out, I think, 2 Halo Jones stories, which were enormously popular, with particularly with what you might call this new audience we were discovering, this audience of who would have loved Warrior comic, who loved Alan Moore's material, and in the fullness of time, I think Grant Morrison on Zenith and so forth. But up until then, you had so there's almost a split in the audience. So that's the background, and then the other person who's mentioned in this memo is Alan Grant and Robin Smith. And the other context of the memo would be by the 80s, we were all getting pissed off because, and when I say all of us, I mean every single one of us, we were saying, look, Judge Dredd's selling all over the world, and they're almost Judge, I think there were Judge Dredd pajamas and things. And, what do we get out of this? And Sanders would say, there's no money in this. Go away, stop complaining. And so by the late 80s, everyone was getting really pissed off. So that's my introduction to this memo, which I will hold up, and now I'm going to read it out. And if I fall into talking like John Sanders' rather nasal way of speaking, that may or may not be a good thing. We will see. So it reads, from John R. Sanders to Steve McManus, and it's dated the 12th of April, 1988. And he says, ownership of copyright should not be an insurmountable obstacle between us and our contributors. The only reason we want copyright is to stop any contributor using material we have paid heavily for and in which we have heavily invested, trucking it off to another publisher as soon as we have forked out hundreds of thousands of pounds. There is no comparison here with the book business. Book authors get a small advance against royalties And book publishers don't enormously risk £250,000 launching their author's works. If any contributor can come up with a solution to that problem, they can have copyright. They can have copyright. If not, can't they at least be told our point of view? Like, for example, every one that we publish successfully, 9 others bite the dust. There is no reason why we can't start a contributors cooperative in which we publish their works and they get a bigger part of the bakery. They won't find it so big after forking out distribution, management, promotion, advertising, etc. Expenses, of course, and they probably be at each other's throats for all the reasons that contributors generally are at each other's throats. But let's try it. Talk to Alan Moore. Show him this note. I asked you to arrange for us to meet some time ago. Nothing happened. I'm easily the most enlightened publisher in comics in the UK today. And tomorrow, the world. Is Alan afraid to meet me? Is an enlightened publisher someone who is actually likely to screw up his whinging? Signed, John R. Sanders. And then there's a postscript. Grant and Smith can form their own cooperative, run their own bakery, eat their own cakes. Yeah, so I'll just let your audience sink in on that, because there's quite a lot to absorb there. And what I will do later, after the show's out, I will put it on a blog so they can study it at their leisure. But I mean, and the question you're doubtless going to ask me, and I'll certainly come on to, is what's Pat Mills doing with this memo? And of course, that is very relevant. But just to sort of set the scene again, it's interesting that what John Sanders calls, I mean, Alan is absolutely right. Alan Moore is absolutely right to, say, look, I have a big following. My stories are popular. Why can't I get a better deal? In other words, what John Sanders refers to as whinging is what often applies to me. They usually call me a troublemaker or a moaner, or Pat's constantly complaining. Yes, we are constantly complaining because we're getting a crap deal and we need a better deal. And it's a case of who dares to complain whinges. Who dares whinges. That's how these things are seen. And another thing I should say, just to answer some of the things there, it doesn't cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Even back then, I mean, these figures are nonsense. But there's another thing as well, that John Sanders is almost asking Steve to say, look, figure out a way of doing this. You know what I mean? And John actually was approachable. I would get him to change his mind on occasion, usually on creative decisions. I tried very hard to change his mind on other things, and I couldn't do it. But I always knew that if I hit him the right way, he's looking for a way out of this, and he's just over dramatized the thing, probably because he's, I don't know, a little emotional about all the crap that he's getting from us, because I was dishing out a lot of crap and saying, look, this isn't fair, this isn't fair. He doesn't mention me by name there, but I was certainly, there's a particularly notorious story called Tharg's Head Revisited, where I got all the artists to illustrate their complaints, and we nearly got it into the comic. And the morning it was going to press, John Sanders rang me up and said, what are you doing, Patrick? What is all this stuff? Blah, blah, blah. And I got thoroughly roasted by him. So there's all that kind of thing. And there's another element I think is important here, and he actually mentions, which is, all the creators will be at each other's throats for all the reason they usually are. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, because without getting too left wing here, it's a classic technique of bosses. You divide and rule. You turn people against each other, right? So that, you know, as long as you're all fighting with each other, you're not saying, well, wait a minute, this is the bastard who's really causing all the problems. And it's, you know, I mean, governments do it, big businesses do it. It's well known, and yet we all fall for it. You know, we all fall for it every time. So, if you like, that's the background. Now,
you know what? Real quick, Pat. I just just to get some context for Saunders, is he even as publisher, is he beholden to stockholders and stuff like that? Like here in America, you know, Marvel Comics, back in the day, it was Martin Goodman, and the buck stopped with him, and he was the publisher. But now we have these people who, they're called publisher, but they're really they're still employees of a bigger entity and still beholden to the business interests of a greater division. So was this guy, like, the buck stopped with him, and he was the god of this, or he still had bosses over his head?
He still had bosses over his head. And in fact, to put it in its full context, John Saunders had been a publisher at IPC Magazines Limited. When 2000 AD came out and all these other comics I've mentioned, they all came out from IPC, which stands for International Publishing Corporation Limited. And this was a massive conglomerate. So he would have been just one publisher in that section. Now, by 1988, comics have started to... I think it's fair to say that John Wagner and I really created a renaissance and a boom in comics and sales. And then we went back to being freelance, and they wouldn't give us the kind of money we wanted in our different ways. And once again, comics started to go down the tubes. And that's relevant to this, you see. And the reason was, again, because they're staffers. Someone like Steve McManus, right? At the end of the day, he's a staffer. You know, okay, if he has a failure, well, actually, there's no word of a lie. If you have a failure and you're a staffer, you usually get promoted and serious about. No, in Britain, that's how it works.
That works here too.
Does it work that way in the States?
Certainly.
I wouldn't have thought so. I once worked for an American company. They were really aggressive. You know, anybody who wasn't quite up to it, out the window they went, you know. But yeah, in Britain, the managing editor at this time, Gil Page, had a string of failures behind him. And I'm sorry if, you know, any fans hearing this who love the past, those are the hard facts. And I say them as a freelance because I'm only as good as however many successes I have or whatever. So Steve McManus had successfully avoided anything like that. And obviously he'd taken over 2000 AD from various people before. But whatever happens, his ass is not on the line. You know what I mean? If they say one day, Steve, we're not very happy with you, here's your redundancy, go away, he still has a golden handshake. And so that's the attitude. Now, what's important here to know is that by about 1986, British comics are going down the toilet again, just as they first did when John and I came in on the scene. And they're going down the toilet again because it's run by staffers who, they don't give a damn, really. They care a bit, but they stop at 5:30 and they go down the pub, and that's the end. And why not? You know what I mean? What's in it for them? That's their attitude. So as a result, what were known as the juveniles, which was the girls' comics and the boys' comics and probably the nursery comics, and I think maybe some of the teenage romantic comics, they were all sold to a guy called, whose name you'll know, Robert Maxwell. And so hence this is Maxwell Communications. So it's been taken over by Maxwell, whose daughter, as we all know, is Ghislaine Maxwell. And apart from the fact that he would later run off with their pensions, you know, so it's been so John is still publisher, but he's obviously way down the line, way below Robert Maxwell. So yeah, he only has so much autonomy. He only has so much power. And I would say that that's quite a difficult position to be in. I'm trying to be reasonable here. You know what I mean? You've got all these belligerent guys below saying, give us more money, give us more rights, you know, and then you've got all this power above, and, you know, and you're sort of somewhere in between the two. So that, if you like, is the background. And shall I fill you in on that? Now, the next bit is based on, well, it's based on my recollections, but I've no reason to think, unless I've erased some traumatic incident, that there's anything missing from them. So what am I doing with a memo, which is obviously a very personal memo between John Sanders and Steve McManus? And the reason is, and I'll summarize it a bit, although I can go into it further if necessary. Steve wanted to know not so much what my reaction to that memo was, but to additional information that the memo doesn't mention, which is, he said, we're going to give Alan Moore copyright on Halo Jones, right? And so it's like, well, you know, why are you telling me, Steve? And it's like, well, how do you feel about that? Now, I don't know, how old was I at the time? Late 30s, I think, something like that. Now, with the wisdom of age, I would immediately go, wait a minute, what's going on here? But I don't know, maybe I was a bit dumb in my 30s, because it never occurred to me to say, Steve, why are you having this conversation with me? And of course, the reason with the wisdom of age goes something like this, that he wanted to see what we as freelancers, and I would imagine he showed this memo to others, but because I was the ringleader, maybe it was enough. And I said, look, I'm delighted. Good for Alan, you know, if he's getting copyright on Halo Jones. But can I just remind you that we've been keeping your comic going. I probably used a lot of effing and blindings in the middle of all this. You know, myself, Carlos Esquera, John Wagner, Brian Bolland, Dave Gibbons, and you know, we've been keeping the comic going from 1977 or something, right through. In other words, for the last 10 or 11 years, we've made this comic a success. Don't you think we should be rewarded as well? And that's actually what he wanted to hear, because it's like, well, you know, because you're all going to be up in arms, if one person gets the copyright, then none of you get it. It's classic divide and rule stuff. Now, I'm sure when Steve hears this, he will have his own spin on it. And I'm quite prepared to be enlightened by whatever I missed. But what I do remember, and I'm sure Steve will confirm this, was that it wasn't so much that I was concerned about any one creator getting the copyright. It's like, why can't we have our rights too? You know, that was uppermost on my mind. And I think there was probably a fair bit of effing and blinding, as I'm sure Steve will say. So I think in a way, I became the kind of fall guy on this. And anyway, so it's my understanding, and of course, nobody speaks to each other that much to really confirm this, but it's my understanding, I think, that Alan was actually promised the copyright, and then they took it away from him and said, no, you can't have the copyright. Now, I could be wrong on that, but that's definitely my recollection, because Sanders did that with me about 5 or 7 years earlier, where I actually had the copyright on a few stories. One that 2000 AD readers will recall, the Terramex, which is a particularly popular story. And the reason is because I had the copyright on it. He said at that time, yeah, you can have copyright, it's no problem. You can see from his memo, he's wavering. he's almost wanting to be seduced into it. Do you know what I mean? In other words, yeah, it's going to be okay, John. Look, let's just find a way through. But McManus wasn't going to do that. And in a way, I almost blame myself, because I think I know what John's like, and he can, you know, if you get it right, you can persuade him. Because I had the copyright on a whole bunch of Robusters stories. And then they said one day, we've changed our mind. You can't have it. You can't have it anymore. So this sudden change of mind is, I think, indicative of the pressures they're under. You know, so there's all this pressure going on, and, you know, one minute they think it's okay, and then they change their mind. I'm sure you're much more organized than States. I can't imagine. Tell me Marvel and DC don't do this.
I can't tell if you're joking or not, Pat, because I think about the can of worms that was open with the Kirby estate, and I mean, if Kirby would get copyright, then, you know, Jim Starlin, who created Thanos, would have to have copyright. Like, it would just, they instituted this practice a long time ago, and everybody seems to accept it, and, you know, it's simply not going to change in that space. But so the thing to do is, here in the States, most people, you know, they get some popularity with a Marvel DC project, save their good ideas for their Image comic or something, their creator-owned comics that they can then prosper from, you know, get 100% ownership of, deal with the Hollywood part of it, and all of that. So it's just as messy, probably in the same. It sounds like the same way.
The role model is identical. That's what happens today. I know of a very successful 2000 AD writer who says roughly the same as I used to say, that he keeps his best ideas back for somewhere else, because if they go into 2000 AD, in other words, nothing's changed. We're in the same situation today as all those years ago, and he just holds everything back, and it's the same story. And of course that ultimately takes us back to Spacewalk. And as I say, I actually feel a bit guilty about it, because I think Spacewalk's worked. You know, the early projections and so on indicate if it carries on in this way, we should all be home and dry. And I think, why didn't I do this before? Why didn't someone else do it before? Why didn't we all do it before? You know what I mean? It's like, you know.
I think a big part of that, the world we live in now, is we have access, direct access, and we could communicate to our audience, and sort of, you know, the fashionable term is pivot. If things go one way that we didn't expect, we could go another, and we have that data immediately. And I mean, who knows how the heck you guys.
My wife Lisa uses the same term. She's always saying, yeah, we're able to pivot, whereas she's, in her view, companies like Rebellion or Maxwell or whatever, they can't pivot in the same way. I mean, if we got feedback on Spacewalk that the direction we were going in wasn't quite right, we could pivot in a slight, we can move in that direction. We're able to interact with our audiences, and that's probably what's done this, you know, that we're able to do Spacewalk. What I'm actually surprised is the financial model that we're using. As far as I mean, it's certainly not imitated in the UK. We did some checking, and we're not aware of anyone doing it in the US either. And because I don't want to be alone in this kind of particular methodology, the financial model we're using is print on demand. So when we come out in October, now we've already produced comics print on demand, so we know the quality is there, we know it works, but it means that you don't have to have a warehouse full of, you know, you've done a print run or something, and you've got your garage full of old comics and stuff. And even more importantly, it goes straight to the consumer. Now, we've done that successfully with a story called Psycho Killer. We've done it with Carlos Esquerra. Just before he passed, he did a book with us, Judge Dredd coloring book. And and it works. So it's print on demand. which means you're not having to put all your energy into a fundraiser. Now, we find everybody else wants to do a fundraiser. And Lisa, who is my wife and publisher, is not remotely like John Sanders. She looked very carefully into crowdfunding. And she said that the energy you put into it, or using a Patreon system or whatever, whilst it has its value and so on, it's print on demand works for us better. And I'm sure it probably would for other people, because you're not then kind of beholden to a lot of people. If we get it right, it works. And if we get it wrong, we haven't got to answer to a long list of Patreon people or people who've given us large sums of money to get it off the ground. So for us, this system works. The last time we checked, and it was a good, maybe over a year ago, I'm only aware of one American comic using the print-on-demand system. There must be others.
There's a couple. Rick Veitch, one of the artists that worked with Alan on Swamp Thing, he does print-on-demand comics and pretty much swears by it to this day.
Good. Okay. I don't feel quite so alone then. That's good. It's good to be in that good company. Yeah.
There's a lot of weird examples of that technology and how that's affecting things. Like one of the things that opened my eyes to the print on demand as being an option is Fantagraphics has done print on demand, especially whenever a book sells out quickly. They did it with The End of the Fucking World. Charles Foreman had a Netflix show based on his graphic novel.
Great film. Yeah.
And the graphic novel sold out faster than they thought. And so it would have been 3 weeks or 4 weeks before they could fill orders, or they could use Amazon's print on demand. And like that really opened my eyes to like, if good enough for Fantagraphics, certainly an option for me.
It's good too that there's now the fulfillment part with the people like Amazon, because like I use print on demand for my first stuff, and but I still had the bricks of books shipped to my house. It's like I took the orders and had to distribute the stuff myself, and it's like, all right, now I'm fulfilling orders by day and drawing comics at night, and became 24-hour process.
Yeah, and that system you're talking about, there is a printer that ties in with that whole print on demand thing. So you can run off a whole bunch of copies, and you get the relevant discounts for comic shops and things. So apart from, as it were, individual copies to creators, to consumers, there'll also be copies going out. So you have let's say a chain of comic shops. They might order a bunch, and Ingram Spark, I think they're the people who are tied in with this whole system, and it works. And I think, what it is, certainly when I started, I think it's probably true for a lot of us, what we all really want to do is we just want to write and draw. We don't really want all this shit, do we? But I'm gently trying to get this across to my 6 founders of Spacewalk, these artists, that, the more that they have the power, and part of that power is, Stan Lee's great responsibility. You've got that whole thing of, you've got to have other skills as well, marketing skills, skills. Marketing is okay. I'm all right with that side of things. But all those digital skills, in preparing something. One of the toughest tasks for us on Spacewalk was making sure that everything was the right DPI, and there was a lot of swearing going on. Believe me, when we got, what the fuck is this guy done? It's the wrong DPI, it's the wrong this, or it's the wrong that. But fortunately, Lisa is, even though she would say she's not particularly technically minded, she had no choice. She had to become technical. And we've all got to learn these skills, unfortunately. I think the days when we could just say, hey, I'm just going to, you're going to draw your cartoon strip, and I'm just going to sit there and write stuff, and, I think they've gone. And even if you work for the man, there's still, people think, I can think of at least one 2000 AD artist who should be nameless, who still thinks that, with a conventional product, you can, find a publisher who's going to be really benign and take you out to dinner and, launch your new project. It's never going to happen. And maybe it did happen probably before my time. It's one of those myths, you've got to be about 100 years old. But I remember going to one publisher, Simon Bisley and I were going to do a comic strip version of James Bond. And
that sounds like the nuttiest idea I've ever heard in my life. Keep going. That's great. That's awesome.
Well, I can tell you his pencils were really bloody good, but there were any number of hurdles as you could possibly imagine in that situation. But the one that stands out to me the most is that the publisher in question, there was another writer who he was considering for the job. And he said to the guy who was representing me, he said, how many followers has Pat got on Twitter? And I don't know, let's say at the time it was, 1,000, something like that. And he said, now the guy I'm thinking of, he's got whatever it was, say 50,000 followers on Twitter. And so it's like, well, Pat's a non-starter in this because he hasn't got a strong enough social media following. I suppose I could have gone out and bought some followers or something. I think you probably get found out there if you do it that way. But so it's like if you're all those traditional publishers, they're still going to look at you and say, what's his Facebook profile like? How's he doing on Instagram? You're thinking, Jesus, this is but it's life. You've got to change to that new market. And I don't personally have a problem with that, despite my advanced years, because as a freelance, I always had to move with whatever new direction was happening in publishing. So for me, it's like, oh yeah, okay, so we're now going in this direction. All right, so that's how we roll.
It's so clear in this conversation, too. Like the very first time mention of Fortnite, TikTok, maybe one or two other things was ever mentioned on this channel was with you. And I make strict note of that for myself to just sort of be open-minded as things evolve and change. Because just even in our day, like Jim and I, we were taught in an analog way of doing things, and very rapidly computers were integrated into the production process. We had to learn that, but we were still young, and there was a lot of attrition with cartoonists and designers of an older guard who felt that they were too old to make the transition into this other space. So this just carries on sort of that.
I think what it is, what probably drives me is probably two things. One, it's taking back my power. In other words, with print on demand, I have power over my creativity, and the same goes for all the artists that I've recruited. They have power over their work. So if someone comes along and says, well, we want to do something with it, the first thing I have to say to whoever it is, well, I will need to talk to the artist because it's half his project, and if he doesn't like the look of you, then goodbye. Whereas what happens in Rebellion, someone will come along with a film offer or not on numerous characters, and you don't know what's happening to it. And as the creator, you're the last person to be consulted. And so there's all that freedom that matters to me, and that's why I'm adapting to this new age. And then the other thing is, I feel, I don't know about guilty, maybe I do a little bit. We lost that kid audience. I mean, comics were for kids, and I know you've got the same problem in the States, and there are similar explanations given. I grew up as I didn't particularly like comics that much as a kid, but they were just part of my life. And hey, these are good. I like Sad Sack, for example. make you want to slit your wrists reading it. And it's like a lot of today's generation, I don't know about in the States, but certainly in the UK, a lot of them have never read a comic. And it's certainly where the Brits are concerned, it's our fault, because we were following those increasingly older audience. And it's not a case that, well, if you appeal to a 45-year-old, you can't appeal to a 14-year-old. Of course you can, without in any way compromising the product. Because, I mean, 14-year-olds like James Bond, 45-year-olds like James Bond. Both age groups like Star Wars, there's no problem. But somehow it's all become very elitist and graphic novel orientated and so on. So I think because I feel I was as much a part of that process as anyone, it's like I need to put that right before I, hang up my clogs.
Pat, let me ask you a tough question. What if an artist that's part of Space Warp, what if they leave? What if they're not delivering their work on time and you have to fire them? How does copyright get sorted out with one of them?
That's not, it shouldn't be tough. Ask me again in 6 months, I might tell you differently. If one of them wanted to leave, right, that would be their right. Unless they were, what should we say, very difficult individuals, they would probably be okay with someone else taking it over. And I'll come back to the detail of that. But the very fact that they put up with me to get Spacewalk out means they're all reasonably flexible. If they had, deep anger issues or something, it'd probably come out by now. I have the French role model, and it's brilliant. I mean, I work for France, Requiem, Vampire Night. And this is why Sanders' fears about copyright and, hey, we've got to have it, and Rebellion are exactly the same. It's all nonsense. If you work for France, you have a very simple formula. You share the copyright with the publisher, and you make an agreement that for a period of time, or perhaps forever or whatever, that you will work with that publisher. So I work, for example, with publisher Glenart, who do Requiem Vampire Night. Now, if I didn't deliver the script, it says very clearly in the contract, it says if you don't deliver the script by such and such a date, and if you don't cooperate, in other words, if you're being as difficult as so many freelancers can be, then we will assign another writer to take over, and they will, let's say the royalties is that much, they will get half the royalties, you'll get the other half. So, you're not losing, whereas with my characters with Rebellion, someone else takes something over, I get that for it, which pisses me off enormously. But in the case of Glenart, what they're saying is, if you're going to be a difficult creator, we reserve the right to get rid of you, blah, blah, blah. Now that's it on paper. In reality, they're much more flexible than that. I mean, the artist on Requiem is years behind on his contract. You know what I mean? In other words, he's meant to have delivered about. Now, technically, they could say, well, you're late on your contract. We haven't got the book out. Therefore, we're going to bring in another artist to take your place, and you will still be the main artist, and you'll get this much rather than that much, right? In practice, they let it go. And they let it go for the same reason that these things happen in the States, right? Because they can't find anyone as brilliant as the original guy. And, it would probably be the same where I'm concerned. They think, oh, God, Pat's being difficult, let's say, or he's too busy doing Spacewalk to take any notice of us. Yeah, well, let's leave it another 6 months. Do you know what I mean? In other words, so there's kind of respect for the creators. I've taken it further on Spacewalk because it's, so whereas the industry standard, and actually that's what McManus should have addressed on this memo, because he could have changed the industry overnight for the better. Everyone's still, you don't expect a character like Judge Dredd, which the publishers own the copyright on, to suddenly be returned to the creators. That's never going to happen. But what was missing is a very simple rule, industry standard, which is, I'm sure it's the same in the States, 50% to publisher, 50% to creators. So 25% to writer, 25% to artist. And that's the same system in France. And we've used the same system on Spacewalk, only we've taken it further. So what we have, for example, is the first payment. Until we reach the first payment level, it will just be split between the artist and the writer, because I'm so associated with the publisher. After all, I'm married to the publisher. So it's like, okay, so we'll just do 50-50 to start with. And once we've passed a certain threshold where they've got money coming in, then it will be 1/3 to the publisher, 1/3 to the writer, and 1/3. And I think that's a fairer way of doing things. So the chances are that we probably aren't going to have any difficult creators. But if one of them said, no, I've changed my mind and I don't want to be associated with Spacewalk anymore. The story is sufficiently, the stories are sufficiently sort of connected in such a way that it wouldn't affect the overarching drama. In other words, there's still these warp lords. Something for anyone that, obviously, if they're new to Spacewalk, they don't know what I'm talking about. There's a theme to Spacewalk, and this was missing in 2000 AD. It's because I ran out of time, but I wanted the stories to interconnect. I was always very impressed by the DC and Marvel universe, the way all these characters turn up in each other's stories. I mean, when it's done well, as opposed to let's make a quick buck by having Spider-Man meeting the Hulk or something. And I've sat in on a meeting like that, and it wasn't nice. So I have a theme. So all the stories are connected. But if somebody says, look, I don't want to draw this story anymore, I don't want to substitute artists to draw it, we can survive without them. I mean, obviously we'd be dismayed, but we'll say, okay, well, we'll send all the angry fan letters on to you, what have you done to the character? So I think it's, the suggestion in John Sanders' memo is that we're all at each other's throats. Well, that's partly because we're all so pissed off with the publishers, and we're all so angry and uptight, and it's that divide and rule thing. But yeah, I mean, artists and writers are always going to fall out with each other. There's no way that's, because it's the nature of things, particularly if you're, let's say, a very creative artist and you're teamed up with a very creative writer. Somewhere along the line, something's got to give, right? In other words, someone's got to say to back down or back off. But as long as you're all making money, and as long as everything's transparent, and as long as there's honesty going on, which is singularly lacking, the complete lack of transparency in British comics today. As long as everything's transparent, what's there to argue about? We're all human beings, and okay, you try one thing, if it doesn't work, try something different. But it doesn't have to get aggressive, shall we say?
This conversation about creator rights is something that we hold very dearly. We come into the game when a lot of people shed blood, sweat, and tears to create a situation where we could own our stuff and have a lot of participation, and we're incredibly thankful for that. One of your main characters that we know you for here in the States, Martial Law, it was a character that you and Kevin O'Neill owned, but DC owns it now. How does that work?
I think I have a feeling it's not that different to the Glenart thing, where, and this is why creator ownership doesn't actually mean you have quite as much power as you might like. I suppose it can vary. I think Martial Law's been around all the publishers. He started off at Marvel. Then he came to a British comic publisher called Toxic. And then when that died, he went to Dark Horse. And after Dark Horse, he went to DC Comics. So they are the publisher, and you make an arrangement with them. I don't know how it's phrased, but you agree to give them certain rights, either in perpetuity or as long as they keep publishing or whatever. But the copyright still remains your control. From a psychological point of view, it makes an important difference because they will consult you. They will tell you about things. But there's one other really important difference where martial law is concerned, which if any film producer is listening, Kevin and I own the film rights and the merchandising rights. So in other words, when we did our negotiating with DC, we managed, after some fairly brisk negotiations, because both Kevin and I are quite good at this, after a lifetime, we had to be, right? So we retained the film rights and the merchandising rights. And so we still got a relative amount of freedom. I mean, one disappointment I have is I always hope that martial law could be the fox let loose into the chicken shed, with the DC universe. Because I know martial law would have some certain views on some of these DC characters, which he's already expressed some. And you probably know the story that DC, and we're only talking about, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, something like that. DC Comics actually approached Kevin, I think it was at San Diego, and said, how would he feel about a martial law Batman crossover? I think Kevin, I probably thought, are you kidding me? And we knew it wasn't ultimately going to fly. I mean, but of course we said, well, yeah, of course. And I like to think we did fairly well because we knew it was ultimately not going to happen. Because, but I think we got past the first two synopsis stages, which is not bad, and we said how, I'm sure, I could see my nose growing as I'm speaking. I think I said something like, martial law and Batman, they have a kind of respectful attitude towards each other. How we tried to get over the problem, and we made, is it Thomas Wayne, Bruce's dad? We made Thomas Wayne a completely evil capitalist bastard, and we had him giving away, what was it, free bat kites to every starving child in the third world for some reason or another. And we thought it was funny anyway. And, so we had Thomas Wayne being an evil scumbag, but Bruce was fine. Bruce was because we thought that way, we might just get this through. And we had a villain who was responsible for killing lots of Bruce Waynes through multiple universes. So, it wasn't martial law who was doing it. So we thought that should be okay. You know what I mean? So we had, this is Kevin, because his sense of humor is very slick on this. So we had a great pile of dead Batmen. And you just imagine how Kevin O'Neill would have drawn that. It's a great pile of dead Batmen. So a huge pile of dead Batmen, and then an equally huge dead pile of Robins, right? And just 3 of Bruce Wayne's girlfriends dead, just alongside. And why would that be? And so there was that's very classic Kevin O'Neill humor. And we had a lot of fun working out the synopsis, and we gave them a very edited version of that when they wanted to see the third synopsis. But sadly, they turned around then and they said that, this wasn't a direction that they wanted Batman to go in. And so we fell at the third end. It's shocking, yeah, I know. It's...
Pat, before we get out of here, let's plug the Space Warp website one more time, and the link will be in the description directly below. So what is that website?
It's spacewalkcomic.com, and Spacewalk is available on Amazon. So if you just type in Spacewalk, it should bring you up there. And it's also available on Comixology if that's your preferred platform. And well, most important of all, I mean, I really want to hear what American readers think of it. You know, it is a British product, but I like to think that much of its content does have an international appeal. I think the artists in question, perhaps some more than others, will press that button in American comic fans' consciousness.
And what is your Twitter account so that we could get those numbers up there for you too?
Ah, Jesus, man. Yeah, this is where I come unstuck, isn't it? Lisa, what's our Twitter account? I'll send it to you after the show.
The link will be in the description below. Before we get out of here, one more Kevin O'Neill story, if you will, because I believe it was a collaboration between the two of you that was full stop. How would you say, man? Censored by the Comics Code Authority here in America for no reason other than they were scared of his artwork. Is there truth in that?
Well, when I was looking at your T-shirt there with Outlaw Comics, it was reminding me of I take it the Comic Code has finally gone.
Yeah, it's gone.
But it's gone within living memory, isn't it? It's what, about 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, and it might as well still be there because they're, the big two. They're not doing anything cool with their characters, really.
Yeah. Well, the story of that, as I recall, I mean, we took the piss out of it in martial law, where we had was it the code of heroes? Heroes had to behave in a certain way. But the full story of it, I believe, and doubtless there'll be a comic historian fan who will put me right if I haven't got this quite right.
We just got a call from Paul Gravatt.
I think it goes something like this: that I think Kevin had gone to work for DC. And he was doing some kind of backup story, possibly with Alan Moore. Now, whether it was an alien crucifixion thing, I mean, why they're getting Kevin to do an alien crucifixion? If I was DC, I wouldn't have him do one. Whether it was that or whether it was something to do with the Batmite or something, I don't know. But it was something for DC, probably with Alan. And so it went to the Comic Code Authority, and they said, no, we're not having this. And I had some sympathy with them there.
Oh, okay.
I can see why they would think that.
I'm mistaken. I somehow thought that was a martial law story.
It should be really, shouldn't it? No, I think for the most part we kind of got away with an awful lot of our stuff. I will mention one other story, though, where we did come unstuck, and because I remember Kevin seemed shamefully proud of it for some reason. Let me just make a note of this. Yeah, but then so they said, I assume the DC editor said something like, "Well, we'll get the artist to redraw this scene," and they said, "No, it's the artist's basic style. It's the way he looks at life." That's the problem. And, I can sort of understand that. They're thinking. So a few years ago, when Kevin and I were in New York on one occasion, we asked to visit the Comics Code Authority because we really wanted to see who these guys were, and to see what they were all about. But they wouldn't let us in for some reason, probably wise, because I think we said that we were really interested to see how things were controlled for the benefit of youth and all this kind of stuff. But, I think once again they saw through us, sadly. But it does remind me of one martial law story of there was some guy in Texas called Buddy Saunders who was he had a comic shop, and he was particularly offended by a scene where we had this character called Judas, who was a kind of Joker-like psychopath. And this kid had got lost. And so this Judas guy says to the kid, where do you live? And the kid says, I live in Santa Monica. And so the Judas guy, I'll stand up for this. He drop kicks the kid, right? Whatever it was, say 50 miles through the air in the direction of Santa Monica. And Bunny Saunders was really offended by that and refused to stock martial law. And I think spoke out publicly about how wretched it was. And
we've seen some of those articles.
Suitably ashamed of ourselves.
I believe he sells all of the martial law bibliography on mycomicshop.com now.
I was gonna say, just speaking out, probably sold a few extra copies.
I'm good, Jimmy. Honestly, I could talk for another 2 hours, but we should really wrap this up.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop probably for now.
Pat, thanks so much for coming by. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and best of luck on Space Warp. Kayfabers, go out there, check this thing out, man. It's pretty awesome.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been a real blast talking to you. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you a lot.